Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the July 2020 meeting of ORION. ORION is in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, but we serve East Tennessee and we support science, astronomy, education, and of course, this includes Roane State Community College and Tamaki Allen Observatory. In our monthly meetings, we discuss topics usually of physics and astronomy, but sometimes they range out into the community, and we try to look at things that are being neglected, including climate change, including, at this moment, COVID-19. So COVID-19 is a problem. It's affecting us personally. It's affecting our culture, our society, our education. And what do we do about it? Well, the first thing is masks. We all know that. But we got to ask ourselves, how important are they? How important is education? And tonight we're looking at COVID-19. We have a two-part program on COVID-19, actually a three-part, because we're going to at the end include some astrophotography, which we always include in our programs. But first, we're going to have a presentation on how we model it mathematically, how we understand what's important in the spread, the epidemiology of COVID-19. And for that part of our program, we have Dr. Ted Barnes. I'll tell you a little bit about Ted. He's had quite a career. He's still active. He received his bachelor's from University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, both his master's and PhD came from Caltech in theoretical physics. And he's continued in plasma physics and theoretical physics. He's had a series of industrial postdocs and research appointments. He became the first ORNL, UTK, that's Oak Ridge National Laboratory, University of Tennessee, Knoxville, collaborating scientist. He was with ORNL Physics in UK Department of Physics. And he's gone ahead from that. His professional interest involve what he calls QCD. I think that's quantum chromodynamics. In nuclear physics, computational physics, and quantum magnetism and neutron scattering. He has a lot of publications, like 120 in those fields. And he's an APS fellow. He joined the Office of Nuclear Physics at DOE headquarters. He was in the nuclear physics program manager position. He returned to Oak Ridge. He's been doing lots of nice astrophotography. So we're really, really fortunate to have him, and I look forward to his presentation. As I mentioned earlier, the topic is, I'll read it, COVID-19 case numbers, theory and experiment, Europe and North America. We'll have a few questions at the end.
So Ted has been developing some models of the COVID infection rates, and I think he's going to describe those in more detail now and tell us how he calculates things.
All right, does that work?
Yeah.
So I wrote a talk about how I'm trying to do numerical fits to the COVID case numbers, mainly for Europe. European countries got through it more quickly than we did, obviously. So I get to see the beginning and the end. So I'll show you a lot of Europe and where I and my friends came up with this model. And then a little bit at the end about North America. I wrote the talk first with the grungy stuff. If you're a physicist, you'll enjoy it. Otherwise, I hope it's enjoyable, but it may not be. And then I turned the talk inside out because I thought people want to see the latest numbers. Just how bad is it now? What's it look like today? So the first 6 slides will be about where we are now in case numbers. So here we go. So this is what's going to happen. First, the recent headlines, and then developing a model by data gazing. This is just cheating and staring at the data until you think you see some sort of mathematical trend in it, and then formalizing that mathematical trend into a real model. Then finally, near the end, I actually read some papers on epidemiology to see what the experts really do. And I was urged by my friends to do this. You know, you're playing with functions. Come on, figure out what the real models look like. And so I did that, and it turns out that what I'd come up with is pretty close to existing epidemic models. It's a simple modification that turns one of the standard textbook models into what I've been playing with, which is kind of neat. It's also kind of bad because I thought I had something really new, but it's I've rediscovered some things. And then finally, I'll show you 3 examples of what's going on in North America. North, South, and Middle. Okay, so here we go. The world status today, there's about 15 million cases reported. I'll also give you some websites that you can go to. The best I've found for any of the statistics is bottom right, worldometers.info. They really are up to date in their numbers, and they actually check people's numbers that they're reporting and see if they're consistent. Sometimes get back to them and ask for corrections. So that's the really professional place. 600,000 fatalities. Okay. So, and there's also a rumor that there are lots of asymptomatic cases. If there are, we don't see them. So it's kind of hard to be sure about that. There have been some antibody tests to see just how many asymptomatic cases there were, like in one place in Italy where they're basically through. And it turned out it wasn't the huge multiplier, like 10 times as many asymptomatic as people are saying. It was more like a third of them were asymptomatic. So, but this is kind of up in the air of how many you can't see. But I'm just trying to do fits to how many are seen and reported as being serious coronavirus cases. Okay, so here we go. That's yesterday. The US status as of yesterday, we've hit 4 million cases and about 145,000 deaths. I just checked and we have passed 145,000. This is kind of disturbing because we're a large fraction of the world's cases. We're about a quarter of them in this country. We're supposed to be so technologically advanced, and apparently something's going wrong here somewhere. So also from the Worldometer site, you can see country by country, here's how we're doing. Alas, we're number 1. You can see top left, we're and that's several days ago. That's 4 days ago, but you see the numbers, they increased rapidly. We had 65,000 new cases then. There's been a jump, as the doctors from Tennessee were saying, in recent weeks, presumably as a result of us trying to open up the country too soon. And so we've even hit 70,000 new cases per day occasionally. And so anyway, there's the top 5 countries. You see Brazil is second, shortly, not far behind us, India, Russia, South Africa. And as for cases, fatalities per fraction of the people who've got it, total cases per million, you can see that as the nearly last column on the right. We're actually pretty bad there too. We've got about 1% of the population has had it, and we're comparable to Peru, a little bit behind Chile, but they have a much smaller total caseload. Right now, this is the really scary thing. This is what's happened to us. We, in a lot of countries in Western Europe that I've been following very closely, initially it propagated and rose up and peaked in the beginning of April. You'll see a few figures I got from European countries where you see that happening. But then for the most part, they recovered. Their fall in this is cases per day. So their fall has been about 2 or 3 times as long as the characteristic rise time, but they did get back down to near 0. Most of the countries in Western Europe are essentially over it. We just didn't decline, and I keep thinking, is this all those people running around without masks and all those kids at the beach in Florida and things like that, just bad habits. But whatever the reason was, we didn't really decline all that much, and we were in a great hurry to open the country up for business again, so we threw open the gates and said, everybody go out and play, and you see what happened. From the middle of June, we just hit another rapid increase. And this is why we can't have any in-person meetings anytime soon, is we're just climbing and climbing. Fauci was shaking his head and saying he was afraid it might be as bad as 100,000 cases per day. You can see we're not that far away. We've been hitting 70-some thousand cases per day lately. So that's really the bad news, that I had thought we would be over it by June in my initial models, but I've given up trying to fit this country because it's just, we're different from everybody else. Okay, now, next slide. This is getting more local. Here's Tennessee. People were asking about Tennessee a bit. I can't quite see, I've got people on top of the figures at the right, but when I did this, which was 4 days ago, we had 76,000 cases reported in Tennessee. As of today, we have 88,000 cases in Tennessee. It's going up by about 20–25% a week, something like that. And it's very localized. This is when you look around the country, you see, and you've heard this before, the major cities really get hit hard. Memphis and Nashville are the 2 real hot spots in Tennessee. Chattanooga is a secondary hot spot, and Knoxville is lucky. We're the Knoxville area is sort of 4th, about 4,000 cases. Again, this is 3 days ago, so the numbers have gone up from there somewhat. can see Anderson County, where I live, so I've been watching that closely. I remember when it was 10 cases, watching it turn into 13 and then 14 and 15. And now it hasn't taken that long to go from 200 to 280. So it's kind of scary. If you look down in the middle bottom left, you see a graph of confirmed cases as cumulative cases. And you can see we're on a ski slope that's going up. It's just not an inflection point. And there are questions about what's the age distribution. Have a lot of young people been reckless? You can see confirmed cases by age, that's true. The number one point in the histogram is the 21 through 30 slot. And those of us like me who are in the 60 to 70 slot have been staying home and avoiding all this. Good news is you don't even have to wear a mask if you stay home all the time and don't see anybody. And it's younger people now who've been the cases most recently. We're up to about 2,500 new cases per day typically in Tennessee at the moment. And as I said, the good news, this may be just slow reporting, but the good news has been it's about 1% fatalities, at least reported. Okay, so that's the headlines. Now we'll go to the personal story of trying to come up with some way of describing those curves. Now, the way I got into this is, if you remember February and March, suddenly people were starting to get very, 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 very worried, even panicked about the rise of this infection. And the people they interviewed on TV initially were not much help. They talked about tens of millions of cases maybe in the US, exponential growth, 95% infection rates to give us herd immunity. It was scary. And when you listen to medical experts, they didn't seem to know that many functions. So I was a little skeptical. They knew about exponentials. They talked about exponential growth. And then they talked about flattening the curve, which you can't do with exponentials. So I wondered, how much do they really know about functions? And so several of my colleagues and I, who talk to each other on Facebook and by email, decided we'd better get to work. And I really, because I was worried, I wanted to see how bad this was likely to be. So we thought we'd stare at the data ourselves and see if we could try to understand it and get some more reliable predictions. Now, the early data that was available was how many cumulative cases there are by country. I call it P of T, and how many new cases per day. That's just the slope. You've been through calculus, I hope. Now, if it really was an exponential, like a lot of people on TV back then seem to believe, then the slope over the cumulative cases, dp dt divided by p, should be a constant. That's the lambda in the exponential growth. But when you looked at these data sets, it was not exponential. So this was our first hint that, oh, this is more complicated than we're hearing on television. We being about 10 physicist colleagues. And one guy who turned out to be a meteorologist. So it has non-exponential growth. That's one of the early things we ran into. Now, if you look at dp dt over p and ask is it a constant, you see the graph in the bottom left. That's the United Kingdom for a period of a month and a half. Now that proportional rate of growth is not flat in time. You see? It's getting slower and slower and slower. It's getting harder and harder for the infection to spread. That's good news. One of our people sent out an email said, and the curve is softening, exclamation mark. It wasn't as bad as an exponential. In fact, for all the world, this is a log linear plot. That proportional rate of growth, cases per day divided by cumulative cases, itself looks like an exponential. In a log linear plot, it's a straight line to a very good approximation. So what should be the constant in the exponential growth is really a decaying exponential in time. Really interesting. This looks like a fun game you can play with. All right, solve that differential equation and see what curve you really expect. So that's what we did. We said, suppose the rate of growth is a function of time times the number of cases, where that function of time is just an exponential. Okay, and you can do the integral and solve for that. You get a really weird function. Some of the function theory here is very pretty. This is called a Gompertz function. It's an exponential of an exponential. When I saw that, I thought, wow, this is really cool stuff here. Now, in that exponential e to the minus r naught t, 1 over r naught is a characteristic time. And there are 3 parameters in this cumulative cases curve. I'll be talking about those parameters. There's Pmax, which is the total number of cases you get when you wait for a very long time. The Gompertz curve you'll see is sort of an S-shaped thing. It comes up and asymptotically approaches the total number of cases you get in the society. That's Pmax. There's also tau, which is how quickly you go through the transition region. I guess you can't see my hands moving, but anyway. And then finally, there's where the thing fits on the time axis, the T0. You can shift the curve you get back and forth. And the other thing that the data sets have, as I said before, is the new cases per day, CPD I call it. And you just take a derivative of the Gompertz function and you get that curve. Again, 3 parameters. Pmax, total number of cases you're going to get, T0, which is, by the way, the peak of the infection. T0 turns out to be where you've got the highest number of cases per day. And then finally, tau, that's the speed at which the curve goes through a change, how quickly things go up and down in the infection. So we've got a 3-parameter curve, and you'll just take the data and fit it. I'm a physicist, that's what I do. So I'll start off with Austria. I'll show you a separate fit using these 2 functions to the cumulative number of cases and the rate of change of cases per day. So here's Austria. Now there's the theoretical curves at the top. The one on the left, the top left, is that Gompertz curve. You start off with no infections, and you climb up, and you hit. Can't see it? Is it visible? Somebody said they couldn't see it.
Yeah, I think it's okay. It's a little small, but those of you that can grab the little bar at the right and pull it to the right, you can enlarge the plots and shrink down the picture.
Yeah, you can also grab it and move it around. So, okay, so that's a sort of logistic curve. And just below the Gompertz curve, where you start with no infections and asymptotically go to Pmax, there's a fit to the data from Austria. And you see the points are just sitting right on top of that curve. Isn't that lovely? It's a very good fit. There's a little wobble in the data, but you have to be a little suspicious of the data in some ways. Like in some data from some countries, you see a 7-day modulation, which is obviously how often they report. So you get big increases in case numbers on Friday and Saturday. So anyway, there's the fit to the cumulative number of cases on the left. On the right is the slope of the Gompertz curve. That's that quasi-Gaussian looking kind of thing. You go up and you get the maximum number of cases per day, and then you die away from it. One cute thing immediately is that you die away more slowly than you go up. That's so characteristic of these pandemic curves. Rapid rise and then slower decay. And everything is given, all these features are given in units of tau. That's the characteristic time. Like the full width half max you see indicated there for the infections per day, that's about 2.4 times tau. Now tau, that response time, you can see for Austria is about 8 days. That's how long it takes a society to take the infection. You see in the bottom right, they're climbing up and then they get on top of it and smash it back down again. Tau is the characteristic time for the society shutting down the infection. So Austria ends up with 15,000 cases overall for the whole country of 10 million people. I've got a cat in the window who I'm going to ignore. And their characteristic time, tau, is 8 days. And the T0 is when it hits its maximum. I set my calendar to be days after 18th of March. So their peak was the 25th of March, which was one of the earliest in Europe. Okay, so I've got that expanded a little bit here to see the cases per day. That's the main thing that I've been fitting and trying to understand, because it's as good as using cumulative cases, and it shows you much more clearly where the peak is. One of the good things you get out of this is how many beds you need in Austria. That's the cases per day maximum. And you can just read it off from the formula. From the formula, it's Pmax, number of cases you got, over E times tau. You get 730 cases per day. And if you look at their data, yeah, it's about where the peak is. The data is kind of ratty, but it's about 700, 750 cases per day. It's, in some ways, it's just a convenient parameterization of the curve. If you were a cynic, you could say that. I'm not really understanding things. I've just got a nice function that goes through the curve very well. Okay, so that's what happens in Austria. Now there's data from ballpark of 15 other countries in Central and Western Europe. So I've gotten all their data and tried to fit them all one at a time. And the question is, will other countries be similar to Austria in how quickly they shut down the infection? Because if you think of places like Germany, you expect them to be pretty fast and serious about it. I've lived in a number of places in Europe. Italy, you might think maybe they're more laid back. Maybe their TAU, their response time, will be slower. So this is where it starts to be really interesting, is do you see social differences in the time it takes to shut down the infection? So here's all the countries I fitted. There we go. Ranked in order of their response time. Now the characteristic time for Austria to shut it down, like I said, was 8 days. And that full width half max is about 2.5 times that. So it took them about a month really to shut down their infection. In the curve on the right, you can see a dashed line. That's the Austrian profile. Now, as you work your way through the other countries, wonder of wonders, Germanic countries have a pretty fast response time. France somehow got in there too. Well, they have the Normans, so maybe. And it gets slower as you get to more laid-back Mediterranean countries like Italy. I dearly love Italy, by the way, but their response time is 16 days. The UK is even slower. The worst of all is Sweden.
Yeah.
Sweden has a very slow response time, like they just don't care. And if you look in the two curves I've got shown on the right-hand side, there's the fastest one, that's Austria without data points. There's the Swedish data and the curve going through it. A much more gradual response. Now, when you look into this, it turns out they have a country national epidemiologist who told them, we're not going to social distance, we're not going to wear masks, we're not going to close borders, we're going to let this just wash over us, and we will develop herd immunity. As a result, he actually said this. And as a result, they've had, they did flatten the curve though, that worked, but the curve is so much broader that it's not clear that flattening it was a good idea. It's hung on for a much longer period. The Swedes suffered through hell because of this. They've had 2 to 3 times as many cases in Sweden per capita as they had in Norway or Denmark. They just had a really rough time, and people are saying now this epidemiologist should stand up and be responsible for this because it was bad policy. Okay, so very interesting. There's a range of different TAUs for different countries. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about what you actually find in review articles and textbooks on epidemiology. Here's what they really do. They don't just stare at the data. They have models where you take the population and divide it into boxes, exclusive categories. And the classic textbook model is called the SIR model, S-I-R. The 3 categories are the susceptible population, the infected population, and the recovered population. Or resolved if you include deaths, because that's, they're through anyway. So in the SIR model, you'll start off with everybody insusceptible and nobody infected. That's not quite true. And then you turn on the infection and some people leak from susceptible into infected. They sit there for a while and get better and come out on the right-hand side into resolved. And you write down a simple first-order differential equation for each of those properties. Like if you throw a calculus around a lot, you can see that bottom equation says the rate at which the number of people recovered increases is proportional to the number of infected. Pretty obvious, and there's a proportionality constant called beta. The interesting thing is in the top equation, the rate at which people leave susceptibles and obviously become infected, that's proportional to the product of the number of susceptibles times the number of infected. The more people running around, the more likely you're to become infected yourself, and the more people in contact with them who are not infected yet. It's the product of those two that determines the rate of propagation into the infected category. So there's just 2 free parameters. You start off with inertial conditions and you fit them, and you can get a curve. This one's not realistic because if you look at the arrows, it says everybody is going to get sick and everybody is going to recover. No, the real world is more complicated than that. Also, if you start off with everybody insusceptible and nobody infected, you're completely safe. because there's no contact with infected people, so it just sits there. So you have to seed it with a few infected cases and a lot of susceptible cases, and then you watch it evolve. Now, what I'm doing, the thing that gives my equations, it turns out, is very similar to this, with one little wrinkle thrown in. I gradually realized that, what my equations are equivalent to, because I didn't realize they were a simple model until I obeyed my friend's instructions and read about the simple models. What I think I'm building in is the fact that we're intelligent prey animals. We don't just sit there and get infected. We can learn. We can learn to avoid the predator. So I added a box of hidden people. Okay, now when we start this thing up, the susceptible people don't just get infected and move to the right, they can also move into a hidden box, H. And you write down first order differential equations with rate constants in this game. So RH is the rate at which you move from susceptible, come and get me, I'm not wearing a mask, to hidden, meaning I'm staying at home, I'm wearing a mask, the probability of finding me is much less. And because of that movement, and I'm assuming in the model that the movement is dominant, that's much faster than the rate of infection. When you get right down to it, it's only like 2% of people, 1.5% of people have gotten infected. So that's a small perturbation on the total population. So hopefully the dominant process is people going from susceptible to hidden. And if that's that constant rate, then the number of people who are still susceptible decays as an exponential. That's what I saw in the data right in the beginning, that the rate of infection was decaying as an exponential. I mean, we all saw that and we had no idea why. In this simple little model that's built in automatically. And that social response time I've been telling you about down there at the bottom left in red, the tau, is just 1 over that rate constant for leaving susceptible and going into the hiding box. By the way, that hiding box doesn't necessarily mean physically hidden. It means anything that reduces the rate of infection that you do moves you out of that dangerous S category and to some extent into H. Wear a mask, stay away from large gatherings, lots of people. All these things will reduce the chance that you're going to be a target for the infection. And so I thought, okay, this is very cool. I've got a model that gives the equations. I've written a preprint on it now, describing it and everything. Unfortunately, I've read in the papers that I found the model. It's called the SIRV model, and it was used as a model of vaccination. So the idea is people can move from S into V. Now, at least I've got something different, because with vaccination, you can play with the time dependence of vaccinating people and see the effect that has on the SIR model. So anyway, this is no longer a crazy theoretical physicist's model of epidemiology. This is a known model that I just happened to have blundered into and have been trying to solve. Okay, so now see what the model is in terms of epidemiology. It's fairly sensible, and it's just a matter of fitting the constants in the model to a given society and seeing how you describe it. So I'll go back to 3 new North American countries now, which is what I was holding off for you. So North America. First, Canada. It's just like Europe. My daughter's in Canada, so I'm really happy to see this. The Canadians, this is fitting my same model, which is that SHIR model. And the parameters that I get from the fitter in the fine print, never mind that. So anyway, Canada peaked and then declined away about 2 to 3 weeks after Europe. They were somewhat slower. They followed the curve very nicely. The characteristic time, tau, is 25 days. That's at the slow end of Europe. That's very close to the Swedish number. Remember, the Swedes were being bad boys and not properly quarantining. So at least Canada has followed through and they've decayed away like this. And so it looks like they're on track for 110K total cases, some number like that. And they're essentially through it. All right, now we'll go to Mexico. This was a real shock. They're nowhere near the peak. Their response time is 65 days. That's incredibly slow. That's 2.5 times slower than any of the numbers I saw in Europe. So they're just responding very, 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 very slowly to the infection coming in. And following this curve, and unless something changes, they'll have about 1.1 million cases. That's what the current fit to the data shows. And their peak isn't until the end of July. The number I get is 31 July from fitting the curve. I also have some physicist friends in Brazil who said, can you please try to fit their data, because they couldn't understand it. This was when it was really increasing rapidly. And I tried to fit it, and it was going faster than the model even allowed. So I said, sorry, I'll have to come back in a couple of weeks and try again. But it now looks like Brazil is sort of following the US. And, parameters are not all that different, except that response time, it's similar to Mexico. In South America, they seem to have a slower response time to these infections. So anyway, that's what Mexico gets, is about 1 million total cases. Population is about 120 million, so they still shouldn't be as bad off as us. You know, per capita, they're about a third as bad as the US, it looks like. But you never know what happens when you get well beyond the data. Now, last but not least, the US. As I said, UFOs are landing here. I've given up trying to fit the US because it's not one society. There's different sites of infection for the US. As you know, it started in the West Coast, then it hit New York and New Jersey. And now it's moving on to the South and the Midwest. Each one of these is really a different, rather isolated infection. And so you just have to choose one. If you wanted to fit everything, it'd be like a physical effect where there's lots of different resonances. You'd have to include a fit to each one of those. So here's one at least that's fairly complete. This is New York State. Now you remember they went through a very nasty time, a large number of cases, but they peaked about the same time Europe did, so a little ways further than the mean in Europe, about the 8th of April. And the response time, this is the reassuring thing, is 16 days. That's mid-range by European standards. So we can do it if we do what New York State did. It's really New York City. The total area under the curve, if you integrate it, is about 400,000 cases. They're essentially through that, but they're really at 430,000 cases. There's something going on. There's a residual tail that's not going away. Could be just places they haven't tracked down and isolated everybody yet. They're continuing between 500 to 1,000 cases a day. When you compare it to the 10,000 and more they had in early April, you know, they're in much better shape. So it can be done, but you can't ignore it. You have to really go to work on this thing. And so that's the end of my talk. Just a little reminder, we've got a task ahead of us, which is to do something about this. And I had a plot of Tennessee daily new cases, but it's not unlike this, except that it was low for a long time. It was basically nearly flat all the way up until around June, and then it started taking off. So we were lucky for a long time, but now we're starting to catch it as well. Okay, so that's what I've been up to. Any questions, suggestions? Anybody know where I can publish my preprint? Because everything else I've published has been theoretical physics. And I'm not sure where you send paper on epidemiology.
I mean, is it possible you could fit the US by having sort of a time-dependent RH? Since
you could.
Some of these parameters seem like they're sort of fixed characteristics of the disease, and others are characteristics of the sociology of people, and and that's clearly changed. You know, there was a lot of people were much more careful in sort of the late March, early April timeframe than they have been in the June, July timeframe. So I'm just wondering if there's a way you could model that somehow in this.
I think, well, you could have a time-dependent RH, but I think that's more work than you really need to do. I think what you really need to do is isolate the local infections. Like when I look at the New Jersey curves, they're very similar to the New York ones. I could have combined them. So you can, you know, just as a rough exercise, you can take 3 states that were in that cluster, or 4 states that were in that cluster, and modeled them with a single infection and a single tau response time. And the recent stuff has been, well, you know, it's been in the news. It's been Texas, Arizona, Florida, and I haven't stared at their state-by-state numbers to see if they also are a good fit to this. Because actually, I've just been trying to finish up my preprint. I just finished it, and so I was going back and refitting Europe because enough weeks had gone by. I wanted to make sure nothing had changed a lot, and a few things had. So anyway, I'm still doing this, and but the U.S. is such a big problem. I talked to Frank Close a lot, who's a former collaborator, and he said, well, obviously in the U.S. it's like a multi-resonance system. You need several different peaks to fit, and then you might be able to describe it. And yeah, it would probably work. There's a number of interesting things to do. Another one, I haven't talked about deaths at all. I haven't even talked about recoveries, but in the set of equations for the full model, there's also recoveries taking place, and there's deaths that you could put in as pretty close to a fixed fraction of the recoveries, but that's a little time dependent. So there's, and I've gone ahead and solved the relevant differential equations for things like the recoveries as a function of time.
Hey, Ted, I've got a question for you. I really think it's neat. I'm sure there's some journals of epidemiology, as well as New England Journal of Medicine, that would, I think they would be delighted to publish. But I think you're not in as bad a shape as you think, because what you postulate is that there are many, many centers for infection, and that these each must have their own curve. I don't think so. I think you can model that with two centers of infection. That is to say, not two centers, two populations, one of which either hides or learns, the other of which does not hide and does not learn. They do not. In other words, one population that does wear masks and one that does not. I think you could deal with it like that. It doesn't have to be 50 different populations.
Yeah.
Just two.
And well, that may be part of it. It may be that the population that's moving from symptomatic to hiding is not going to continue until it's 100% hidden. Instead, it's going to flatten out. Like a third of them will move and hide, and then you're left with the rest being full scale exposed to the reactor as you pull the rods out. So yeah, there's a lot of neat things you could do. I sort of wish I was still a full-time academic, because there's a lot of interesting numerical problems to be studied here. But yeah, that's one of them, how you deal with the fact that people don't necessarily quit. When I've looked at other models where they're trying to describe many effects, one of the problems is if you get more than a few parameters, it just becomes too complicated. And you get detailed fits that involve one parameter being crazy and another parameter being a different crazy to compensate. If it's a relatively simple model, you can tell either it's working or it isn't. And I've been trying to stay as close as I could to that. But yeah, things like this where people have decided, here in the US, obviously, it was the decision to open up the country. That brought a lot of people back together again. So it was basically turning the arrow back in the other direction and reloading the susceptible population. And wonder of wonders that you're confirming that the description was approximately right. That you send them back in the other direction and you'll get a growing curve. So.
Do we have other comments, questions?
I'm curious. One of the things that we heard at the beginning was that this was in a category of the types of things that tend to go away when it gets hot.
Yeah, didn't do that.
We have not seen any sign of that. It's already hot enough now. We haven't seen any sign of that. Has anybody addressed that? Just curious.
Not that I've heard. I did hear one interesting thing about killing the virus, because lately I've been reading a lot of sort of medical chat things where doctors are talking to other doctors online. And one is what can be done to protect people like dentists. And the answer was, well, it's known that viruses of this type, they have some sort of lipid layer around the virus body, and you can kill them by disrupting that lipid layer. And one of the reagents that, and they had a list of half a dozen reagents that kill it. One of them is ethanol. 60 to 70% ethanol. Gargle with that. And you kill some ridiculous fraction like 99.99% of the lipid layer viruses in your mouth. Now I thought, well, that's stronger than normal vodka, so it's probably not realistic. But I checked on, but some people said just gargling with mouthwash has a big effect for eliminating the virus load in your mouth. And I checked, and my mouthwash is 21% ethanol. And they said range 20 to 25% ethanol also does a good job of eliminating, you know, the load of this kind of virus in your mouth. So,
but it does in your mouth, but isn't it, don't you have to worry about what gets into your lungs as well?
well, that's the idea, is it starts in your throat. And that's sort of an easy pathway of getting into the rest of the body. And this was also Dennis saying, what can we do to protect ourselves from our patients? As they see mouth after mouth after mouth.
The main route of entry is through the nose and then through the throat that way. And people were suggesting that, you know, irrigating your nose may be effective just to wash any virus out of it, or they may come up with like an antiviral nose spray that could be used.
That's really interesting. So the concept is really valid, that we could just inject little puffs of alcohol or antiviral nose spray, and we don't actually have to lavage the lungs. We don't have to flush it out there.
I was just reading it. This was just a chat blog of MDs talking to each other and speculating that this might be a way of reducing it. So just one of many anecdotes about what might or might not have some effect. They did say, I mean, they're cynical people. They did say there's no way we can get a systematic test of this done because there's no money in it. This is too simple.
I think that must be the reason we don't know more about masks. There's no one that's going to benefit greatly by doing widespread testing of different types of masks. And I had a friend who sent me a note, and he says, well, you're not going to be able to show me any valid medical test on how effective masks are. Well, not for COVID-19 anyway. You know, I can show him lots of data for wart gases and other diseases, but I don't think companies get rich by testing masks these days.
Well, wouldn't there be an ethical dilemma in doing that test, because you have to have a group that doesn't use it? I mean, you can't do that. So
come to Tennessee.
no, I'm saying if you're running a test, you can't have a person who's agreed to not wear a mask. I mean, that would be unethical.
No, but you got a lot of people out there, Rob, that are not going to wear the mask anyway, who would agree to be part of a test.
I see.
And you have other people like me who would agree to wear the mask.
I think that would still violate the ethics of the study. You know what I mean?
Well,
I don't think it would be ethical to do the study.
with these vaccine tests, they are going to give a certain fraction of people placebos. So, I mean,
Right.
they're doing that there.
Well, that's always been the problem with vaccines. It's why a lot of drug companies have stopped making vaccines, because there's not really much money in them. So.
There's that they say that's an expensive thing that they usually lose their shirt on, and I don't know, but I heard Bristol Myers talk about that when I was employed there.
Yeah.
It's very expensive to make enough for in case there's a bad flu year, and then if it's not a bad, if it doesn't happen to be a bad flu year, you lose your shirt. That's what I heard.
Well, Ted, you didn't come back and show us any other plots. And if you were to show us the plots for the U.S. and India and Brazil and Russia, my guess is you find a country with autocratic strongman leaders, that these are the ones where people are not wearing masks. I wonder if that's the case, if that's a way of distinguishing between those who learn and those who don't learn very quickly.
Well, that's one of the reasons that I concentrated on Europe and Western Europe, And North America was, I felt like I could trust the data.
Yeah, that's
Russia and, you know, I'm not as skeptical about the Chinese, but I'm sure things are watched carefully by the government there. And I just don't trust them. And I don't trust
Yeah.
the US anymore because we're starting to sit on our data.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was the reason. I wanted the data to be as clean and honest as it could be.
yeah.
Well, is there any hope of people actually sharing their data, or is the U.S. government going to sit on it pretty?
Well, they make noise about sitting on it, but I haven't yet seen any changes in the daily updates. Like I checked the Tennessee website and the Worldometer's website
But it's
daily, and it's still coming through.
and Johns Hopkins collects their data from the states. They're not getting it through the CDC or anything. So with this move to move the CDC's data into DHHS and out, you know, where it looks suspiciously like the government wants to control the data, or the administration wants to control the data, but there are other sources that aren't dependent on that. So,
Yeah, I wondered about Johns Hopkins. I used them a lot in the beginning, but it was actually harder to get their data out as numbers. And I discovered in the Worldometer, if you look at it in a Linux browser and just click View Source, there is the whole data file. So it was great to pull it out. And Johns Hopkins didn't have any features like that.
So where does Worldometer get its data, though? Are they getting it from the center?
They're a collaboration or they're a group in Oxford, and they seem to have friends everywhere.
I mean, I look at them too, but I just, I didn't know where they got their data.
For JHU, I was a little worried that, you know, every university has a grant, and the grant is controlled by the government, so they could, in principle, be pressured. And, but you know, a collaboration in the UK is outside of the reach of our funding agencies. So, but that's one of the scary aspects: is when will the lights go out? Hopefully, never. Yeah.
Ted, I think you've got some very good insights there, and I hope you go ahead and publish, because even though you kind of rediscovered the SIR and SHIR and so forth, not really. I mean, you came about it a different way.
Well, the other thing is nobody solved it. That's what I thought as a theoretical physicist I could really contribute, is I just tear into those differential equations and work out the analytic solutions. and people in epidemiology are not going to do that. They do numerical solutions at best. So I can get a lot of nice results. And yeah, I'm going to find somewhere to publish it, but you know, no idea where it'll be at the moment.
I'm sure, I mean, I don't know specifically what they are, but I'm sure that there is, you know, the sort of the benchmark epidemiology journal, just like there is for every other specialty.
Yeah, I thought I might not have so much luck with them, because all the reviewers are going to be graduate students and assistant professors or great epidemiologists, and they'll say, he's not one of us. You know, it'd be like physics getting a paper from an epidemiologist. I'd be skeptical as hell.
Yeah.
And I'd be afraid it was a crackpot thing. So
But 1 year ago, this would be a fringe area, and your worry would be correct. But this now is not a fringe area. It's what we're all concerned about.
It's a really interesting data analysis problem, and you know, you can look for simple effects going on. So
go to physics today.
Yeah, I was just thinking that too. Go to physics today.
Yeah.
They might want it to shrink from the current 13 pages.
No, the point is, how would a physicist solve a problem? How does this compare in insights and approach to what the standard epidemiological approaches come to be? Very different.
Yeah, well, I'm going to try a multi-phasic approach here. Try several different places and see what the responses are. My friends who are MDs said they just didn't know. They really liked the paper, but they weren't at all sure where to send it. I've talked to 2 epidemiologists. One in Caltech was interested, but he says he studies historical plagues. This isn't really him. And another one is a young lady in Harvard, and she said she would read it, and that's the last I heard from her. so I'm going to keep working. I keep knocking on the doors.
Very
You
interesting.
had 10 other physicists working with. Do we know any of them?
Well, Frank Close was one. He's been more of a kibitzer. They're well, Michelle Shin, you might actually know. She's at DOE, but she gives public astronomy talks. She was at JLab for a long time. The other one you won't know is Eric Swanson. He's been my collaborator since he was a graduate student in Toronto, and I was a postdoc, and we've written about 30 papers together. Very strong mathematical guy. But in the end, everybody had their own idea about how to do this, and they all kind of drifted away. And I didn't quit partly because I'm retired, so I could spend all my time doing this. And partly I was getting results that looked pretty good. And a lot of people on Facebook said, you know, we want to see your numbers for Holland, say, my wife's family. So I generate data for Holland, and it just takes me a few minutes. Get the data file and fit it and say, I think you're going to have 80,000 cases. And they said, thank you. That's the most sane thing anybody has ever said to us. so I had quite a few customers when this was first coming out.
Interesting.
Very interesting.
Okay. Okay, folks, thanks for joining us for the first of our 3 videos from our July 2020 meeting. You just heard Dr. Ted Barnes. Be sure you catch Part B. Part B is a panel of, I think you'll see about 40, and the panel is actually bigger, Tennessee doctors who are discussing the situation in Tennessee. And this is a message to the Tennessee governor about what's going on correctly and incorrectly in Tennessee. So that'll be in Part B, and there's also a Part C on astrophotography recently by ORION members. Thank you.